Of course, is about Mary Magdalene, as everyone figured out, I presume, as we were going along. Mary Magdalene. I took a few liberties with the story, and one of the reasons you have to do that is that the story doesn't jive at the end with what you read in other parts of the Bible. It's an important thing to see about the resurrection stories. They're there as independent units in the various Gospels, but if you try to put them side by side or to figure out the sequence of events, you can't do it. They don't jive. So one place where I took liberties with the story was the notion that Mary stayed behind while the other two women went back to tell the disciples who were gathered. But those kind of liberties seem to be somehow necessary if you're going to put the story together. Now there's a few things that one should notice about this story of Mary Magdalene. You probably noticed the way I interpreted the casting out of the 7 devils, and that is as a healing, which is, I think, no doubt the way it should be understood. If you notice throughout the Bible, when people are ill, it is seen as though they're possessed by demons. Any kind of illness was seen that way, and when Jesus cured them, it was talked about, well, the demon left them. The evil spirits left them and allowed them to be cured. It's also important to see that there really is no good reason from the Scriptures for thinking Mary Magdalene was a sinner. As one of our lecturers reminded us recently, talking about Mary Magdalene, Joan Marie Smith talking about women in the Bible. There really is no good reason to think of Mary Magdalene as a sinner, let alone a prostitute, which is the usual associations with her. The only reason people say that is because of the 7 devils that were cast out of her, which, as we've seen, most likely means healing of physical illness. And on the other hand, where there is a Mary who was talked about as a sinner, not necessarily a prostitute, who washed the feet of Jesus with her hair and so on, and there's really no good reason at all, as the Scripture scholars tell us, to identify that woman with Mary from Magdala, this little city up on the coast of the Sea of Galilee. But there are very clear references to who Mary Magdalene is. That is, she was one who ministered to the Lord. It was true that the women in the group took care of their needs and financially. And it was true that she went down from Galilee to Jerusalem with Jesus. It is reported that she was there at a distance from the cross. And in many of the accounts, she becomes the first person to experience the Lord and the first evangelist, the first one told to tell the good news to other people. So Mary Magdalene is an extremely important person in the whole of the New Testament. Some people feel that there's probably an historical basis for this, that perhaps Mary Magdalene somehow held the group together after the death of Jesus, that she was psychologically a very important person, a very strong person for the rest of the people who were so dispirited and down. Well, it's an interesting thing from the viewpoint of reading about women in the Scriptures. Very telling the way the story of Mary Magdalene has been interpreted by male theologians throughout history. And it's very different when women begin to read the story of Mary Magdalene and to pick up on this more positive side of who she really is. So that's one way of thinking about what we get out of this story. The other thing is the whole business of the empty tomb. The empty tomb becomes one of 2 ways that the Scripture uses of talking about this notion of the resurrection of Jesus. It's one of the ways that they are trying to show us what has happened. Now, there are conflicting opinions about, where this all arose and so on. I'm not sure how deeply to go into it. Make a slight stab at it. Some people know the work of Edward Skillebeck, who is a great scholar and so on. Well, Skillebeck thinks that this whole notion of the empty tomb grew up quite late in the first century, and it grew up because people used to go to the tomb of Jesus, the Christians, which they knew there was, and annually hold a celebration there. And it became part of that celebration to talk about this empty tomb. In line with this, when you look at how the evangelists use it, Matthew uses the story as an argument against the Jews. Do you remember how he goes through the whole thing? And this is distinctive of Matthew's gospel. He says that the Jewish leaders, after Jesus was crucified, went to Pilate, and they said, "We want you to guard this tomb, because if you don't, his followers are going to come and steal the body and then say that he was raised to life." And what does Pilate do? Pilate's not going to be bothered. He says, "You want the tomb guarded, you go and do it yourself." Well, they did have temple police, and so as the story goes on, they got the temple police to go there, and they sealed the stone and then began to guard it. Well, as Matthew tells the story, the angel came down, and there was this commotion and so on, and the stone is rolled back, and the guards are frightened to the point of being paralyzed and fall down on the ground. And after they recover, they go back and tell the chief priests that indeed, tell them all that happened. And what do the chief priests do? Remember that? They pay him a large bribe, large sum of money, to say that the disciples of Jesus came, and while they were asleep, that they stole the body. And the chief priests tell these guys who are scared to death they're going to get in trouble for sleeping on the job, that if this comes to the attention of higher authorities, they'll defend them and keep them out of trouble. That's Matthew's way of talking about the empty tomb, which, what impression do you get? I mean, he is fighting a battle. You remember, those of you who were here for the class on Matthew and his understanding of Jesus, Matthew's big bit was to be arguing against the Jews of his time in the year 85 or 90, around in there. So obviously, when he's talking about the tomb, he's got an argument going here. In fact, he concludes the whole bit by saying that story is still around today. That story that the disciples came and stole the body. Jews are still telling that in the year 85 to explain away the resurrection. And Matthew's showing what really happened. It's an interesting way of understanding this story of the empty tomb. In Luke's gospel, the empty tomb seems to be clearly part of a whole picture he's painting for us. And the picture is that is setting the stage for Jesus to be able to go upward, to ascend to the Father, so that he can come back down and appear in many ways to the people. We call that a rapture model. That Luke seems to be having that empty tomb as part of this whole process. Now, other scholars think very differently about the empty tomb. Others think that the empty tomb story started right away, that it's among the earliest stories used to explain this resurrection of Jesus, and that it was a jumping off point. It was the way like of setting the stage. You can see how the stories go. They first come and they look in and the tomb is empty and they don't know, well, what's going on. Oh, and then you get the appearance of Jesus. It sets the stage for the appearance. The same way when Simon Peter and John run to the tomb and look in, and sure enough, the body isn't there. So it is the preparation in the story for the biting, striking statement about the resurrection of Jesus. Now, whatever viewpoint you adopt here, couple things. One of the things, and what Jim was alluding to before, is there's a great debate in the 20th century among scholars about if you went to the tomb, you actually got there at that time, would you find the body there or not? And that scholars have taken different positions on that. I mean, some say yes, some say no. A couple things about that seem important. That is, the empty tomb in itself doesn't prove anything. I mean, just because a tomb is empty doesn't mean that you've got resurrection. Same notion that when you talk an empty tomb, if you keep in mind what I was trying to say before about physical resurrection, we're not talking about a physical resurrection, then that becomes sort of secondary. In other words, our faith is not dependent on that. If somebody found the bones of Jesus in there, it wouldn't have to shake people's faith. Just like when you're looking at the corpse, you don't have to think that that person isn't in heaven because you're looking at the body there. Well, I have the feeling that gets a little involved or abstract or something maybe more than people really are interested in knowing about all of that. But the Mary Magdalene story does tell us about, emphasize the empty tomb, because that's what it is. She's going there. She knows. You know, watch her character. She saw what happened. She saw Joseph of Arimathea take that body there. She saw him roll the stone. She's gone one day. She comes back very early the next morning. She goes there, the stone's rolled back, she looks in, and there's no body there. So the story emphasizes the empty tomb. This much, I think, we got to get a hold of in talking about resurrection. The empty tomb is designed to be one way that the Scripture, the evangelists, the authors of the Bible, have of telling us about the resurrection of Jesus. And in a sense is the negative way of saying it. What it means is that death couldn't hold him. That this isn't ordinary. It's not working the way most deaths and burials work. Something unusual is afoot here. It is bringing us to the point of being able to accept all the first things I was saying about the fact that God is trustworthy and raises up Jesus to life. Well, let's do our one-to-one discussion for a minute, and then let's just do it for a couple minutes and see what happens.
Space time, not physical, beyond space and time. And yet, I suppose one thing I'm thinking about three incidents that just come out of my head that post-resurrection incident where he eats the bread and the fish, falling to the sign that there is a certain amount of physical. Mary don't cling to me, and then the Thomas when he appears and says, look, put your hand in the bowl on my side and hold my hand. Are you denying, how do you put that physical part in there? How do you put that
let me, I'm going to, that's the next step here to talk about, to talk about the appearances, obviously.
You didn't hire me, by the way, yeah.
No, I know. We put a lot of time into this. This collaboration. The sequence that I want to use is the charisma itself, the core message of what resurrection is, and then the two ways of talking about it: one, empty tomb, and secondly, appearances. So your question is, in many ways, needs to be dealt with even before that, I suppose. One of the things, again, Ronner always said is that when you're talking about the afterlife, be careful not to be too imaginative. In other words, remember we're dealing with imagery that's pointing to something that eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor has it even entered into the hearts of us humans what it's all about. Ronner said, be careful not to get to the point of thinking you can imagine what it's like. What we've got is a whole bunch of interesting images that sort of point to the fact that this is beyond expectation. The heavenly banquet, the being in the city of Jerusalem, being with the Lamb, immortality of the soul, resurrection of the body, all ways of pointing to the fact that death is not the end. That death is passageway into a richer, better life. But that. Now, he might be right or wrong about that. I'm just saying he says be careful of trying to be too imaginative in the sense of trying to figure out what it's like. Because it exceeds, it's precisely outside of the dimensions that we know. That's all we know. We have no way of knowing. I've used that analog of saying that maybe the best thing we have out of human experience is when we contemplate animal life moving into being human life. And what happens, of course, at that point is that they leave nothing behind. They take their nervous system and their limbs and their bodiliness with them, but now into a richer life where they can now talk to one another and paint paintings and communicate and develop the arts and civilization and so on, and love and communicate. So what has happened in that experience is one moves into a new dimension of existence, from animal life to human life. Nothing's left behind. That's one way of thinking what movement into the resurrected life is. That is, we don't leave anything behind, nothing of essence. Nothing that we are. And what happens? We move through a passageway into a richer, deeper, better kind of life, where there's more love, more joy, more fulfillment, where we are seeing, and now we use our imaginative terms, seeing God face to face, united with Christ our brother, in the heavenly banquet, walking around the city of Jerusalem together, joyfully and so on. That becomes a way of thinking of it. You say, well, what would the animals, how could they conceive of that other life? Well, the answer is they couldn't. They really couldn't know what it would mean to break through into reflective life. And yet in the evolutionary process, that's what has occurred. So in the same way, Paul tells us we can't know what that life is like. What we do know is that it is marvelous, that it is great, that it is fulfilling, that it is our true destination. But the dimensions that we know, the kind of things we know, don't fit. Our language about God and our language about the afterlife is more unlike it than like it. That's the same thing we got in talking about God. We say God is a father, but it doesn't mean God is male. It doesn't mean God generates children. In fact, it doesn't mean much of anything that we mean by father, does it? The major notes we have of father, what that is, we know don't apply to God. No, but there's some part of it that does, and the part that we think applies is that the good father is loving, that the good father is life-producing, that the good father is cares, is Abba. So our language about God and the afterlife is, as we said in the scholastic tradition, it is analogous. It means it's more unlike than like. Or as we say in more modern terms, it is symbolic, that is, it points without ever capturing reality. And that's our mind. That's why our minds have trouble knowing what resurrection is. That's why the way to do this, I think, is exactly the way I'm doing it. That is to say what it means in other terms, that God is trustworthy. That's what resurrection means for us, practically. The resurrection of Jesus is a guarantee that God is trustworthy, that he won't let us down either. It says to us that love is more powerful than death. All those things I was saying, that's a graphic way we can get a hold of what resurrection is all about, and the fruitful way. Many of you could imagine, so more particularly, well, there was a woman here last week I was talking to her after the class on salvation, and she was very into dealing with death, the death of one of her youngsters, and she's trying to imagine this, and she wants to know exactly how he is up there, and that's a very natural tendency. On the other hand, there doesn't seem to be any clear answer to that. I hope that sort of sets the stage. It doesn't mean that we have all the really important things to say about it, as I'm trying to show here. Let's move on. I think heaven is that we are definitively with God, irrevocably with God. It's not up for grabs anymore. I mean, you can't have blasphemy in that situation. Exactly what death means is that we make final and irrevocable our option for God. So that's exactly what we would mean by heaven. We've got it made, and you can't lose it at that point. That's why we're saved by the death of Jesus. Once that's fixed through the death of Jesus, it's not up for grabs anymore. That death is what makes things final, complete, definitive, irrevocable. And that's what our own death will do. It makes the love bond with God now not breakable, unbreakable. And therefore there's no room for sin, for blasphemy, for anything like that. Now, find the verse and we'll check it out. I don't think it says that exactly. But we'd have to look at that. Okay, let me move on to the last story here. I want to tell you my story now, and I should start back at the beginning where it's really important. That is when I first met Jesus of Nazareth. It's almost as though life started for me right then. He asked me to leave everything and follow him. And so I did. Never really could understand why. I just did. He called and I said yes. Well, I was privileged to be in the inner circle, one of the 12, close by Jesus. He used to go out and preach, and he'd tell these parables. A lot of times people didn't understand them, and then we'd leave. We did a lot of walking, in those days. The master had no place to lay his head. We used to go walking on, and as we'd walk on after we'd leave the crowds, somebody said, well, what did that mean? What was that story all about? We almost never understood them. And he'd try to explain it to us, and sometimes I'd think I'd get it, and then other times I'd think, no, I don't know if I really know what he's talking about or not. Well, I remember one time, we felt good about this, the inner circle, the 12. We almost thought of ourselves like the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel. We thought, well, we're like the new Israel. That's what we are, 12 of us. Take the place of 12 tribes of Israel. Well, I remember the day that we heard that Jesus' good friend Lazarus died. The master was really shook up. He cried right then. Cried when he heard Lazarus died. We couldn't figure out why he didn't go down there and cure him. But then he said, let's go. We're going down to Judea. And me and I was ready to go. You know what I said at that point? I said, to the rest of the group, I could see they were worried. They didn't want to go down to Judea. And they were afraid. It was dangerous, down there. Safe up in Galilee, dangerous down around Jerusalem. And so I said to the other ones, we got to go down with them and be ready to die with them. That's sort of my character. I guess some people thought I was sort of impetuous and so on. But I said, let's go down and die with them. So we went down all right. Eventually went down for Lazarus, came back to Galilee, and then time came when we had to go down again. We went down. Sure enough, after we had our last meal together, we went out, and never forget it, we're in there in the garden. Here comes Judas. We didn't know where he had gone. We thought he'd gone out to buy something. He held the purse, Thought he went out to buy something. And here he's coming with this group of temple guards. Came right up to the Master and kissed him. Said, this is the one. And they grabbed him. I was so scared. He took off. Ran off. Dark moment. Hate to even talk about it. Deserted the Master. I was the one who said, let's go down to Judea there and let's die with the Master. So we get down there, and they arrest him, and I took off with all the rest. It's the worst moment of my life. Can't even hardly talk about it now without feeling how I disappointed myself in the Master. Well, they grabbed him, as you know, and trumped up charges, said he was a revolutionary, had Pilate, weak-kneed fellow, washed his hands of the whole thing. Washed his hands and said, do with him what you want. Had him crucified. I wasn't around. We took off. I was scared. Well, a bunch of us gathered then in the upper room. I was glad we had those other guys around. Gave one a little bit of support. Terrible time, but at least there were other guys. They all had run away too. I felt guilty. None of us talked much about it, the way we felt. Couldn't even bring ourselves to talk about it, but guilt was just through the whole room. Disappointment in ourselves, despondent. We had thought that the Messiah was going to come. We thought Jesus was going to free us all, bring the kingdom. All of that lost. Well, I tell you, staying up there in the upper room, we were afraid of the Jews, but after a while you get cabin fever, locked up there all the time. So one day I slipped out for a while, sort of walked around the street, sort of incognito, didn't talk to anybody. They can recognize you by your accent, down here. Came back, walked in the room. It's unbelievable. They're all jumping up and down. They can't wait to tell me. They're going to believe this, but the Master was here. The Master's been raised to life. He appeared to us. Breathed the Spirit on us. Oh, we're all terrific. I looked at him. I said, geez, I felt funny. I felt like I was alienated. I felt like I missed out on something. I felt like I was an outsider in some way. And I said, well, what was going on? And he says to him, well, the Master, he says, he was terrific. He didn't tear us down. He didn't say, how come you desert us or anything. He just kept saying the same thing over to us. Peace be with you. I don't know what happened to me then. I felt funny. My heart got hardened. I just dug in my heels. I said, I'm not believing this. I don't believe it. Maybe it's because I wasn't there. Maybe I was feeling left out. I don't know. I said, I'm not believing this. Words came out. I said, I'm not believing it. I take my finger and put it in his hand and take my fist and put it in his side where they put the spear in. He kept trying to convince me, but I wouldn't listen to him. I don't know what was going on with me. It felt tight. It felt hard. I felt left out somehow. Like I'd missed out on something. Well, it was a terrible week, I want to tell you. They're all happy and exultant and so on. I'm getting grumpier by the day, more upset as time goes on. It was a week later. We happened to be in the upper, I don't know why we were up there again, but we're in this upper room again, same room. Suddenly, no warning, doors are locked. Jesus is standing right there in front of me. He looked at the whole group, and he said just what they had said he said before. Peace be with you. And then he looked right at me, and I could have melted. Oh, I tried to tell you the feelings that were going through me. My heart started to soften a bit. I was confused. I didn't know what I was going to say or do. And he looked at me and he said, okay, take your finger and put it in my hand here, the holes, and take your fist and put it in my side. And don't persist in your unbelief. Believe. It was in an instant, as I looked at his face, I didn't need to take my finger like that. In an instant, it all changed. My heart softened, grumpiness was gone, sense of alienation was gone. I felt like I had joined the group again, and I just looked at him without any thought or anything and said, my Lord and my God. Well, then he looked at me. In fact, he addressed himself to the whole group, but I knew it was meant for me. He said, you became a believer because you saw me. But blessed are those who have not seen and have believed. And that phrase stuck in my mind. I knew he said it for a purpose. I knew there was a reason for that because I saw and believed. He was telling me something about how I should talk to others. You know, I use that story in my sermons all the time now. When I go out and preach, I always bring in that personal story. And I tell them what went on in my own heart, and how I felt left out, and how my heart was hardened and so on. And then when I end my sermon, I tell them what the Master said. I tell them, blessed are you who have not seen and yet are called upon to believe. Well, we have here obviously the story of Thomas, doubting Thomas, the twin, fellow who was going to die with Jesus and lost his courage, the one who wanted empirical proof for believing in this resurrection. There's an obvious point to the story, and that is that the punchline at the end. It is one of what we call the appearance stories. It's the second major way that we find in the gospel for talking about the resurrection of Jesus, in addition to the empty tomb. It's the way that, the characteristic way of trying to tell people what the resurrection is all about. We've got other stories. There's other stories. You remember the one when the disciples are out on the lake, and Jesus is on the shore, and he tells them to cast out the net, and they catch 153 fish and come in, and Peter jumps out of the boat first, comes in, and then Jesus eats with them. So in the Bible, we have many of these appearance stories. Now, when you look at those stories, if you just think of the two examples, the one you just heard here and the one on the road to Emmaus, there are obvious lessons to be learned, aren't there? I mean, they jump out at you. Or it's almost like they told the story more for us than anything else. So when you read the story on the road to Emmaus, two phrases jump out. One, while he explained the Scriptures to us, our hearts were burning within us. And secondly, that we recognized him in the breaking of the bread. Now, what does that sound like? That's an obvious reference to the Eucharist, isn't it? To the Mass as we know it, the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist. This story, it's an obvious attempt to try to get us to believe, isn't it? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. That's us. That's not Thomas. He saw and believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and believed. We didn't see Jesus. We didn't get the chance to go like that, put the hand in the side and so on. So what does that lead us to think? That these stories are constructed accounts. They're the ways that the disciples have tried in a graphic, beautiful, colorful, pointed way to get across to you and to me, to their listeners, followers, and so on, what the resurrection is all about. Again, if you just take all the appearance stories and put them side by side, they don't make any sense. In other words, one set of stories say Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene first. Another set of stories says that he appeared to Simon first. One series says he appeared in Jerusalem first. Another set says he appeared in Galilee. Put it this way. Peter, when they're out in the boat and they can't figure out who this guy is on the shore and everything, and they come in and they're not too sure about who he is or not, this is supposedly the third time they saw him. Well, I mean, what does that tell you? I mean, you probably wouldn't take more than one appearance to sort of solidify it, for one, you know. What I'm telling you is we're dealing with constructed stories, beautiful narratives, some of the most beautiful things in the Gospels that are clearly designed to speak to you and me to what the faith is all about, what the resurrection is all about. So what do you get out of the Emmaus story? Well, to say that Jesus has been raised to life means that he's present in our assembly, in the Eucharist. That he's really present with us. That's one way we can meet him. We don't have to have been there in the year 30 when this went on. We can meet him in the breaking of the bread now, the Eucharist, and in the liturgy of the Word, and when our hearts ought to be open to that burning, to that thrill, that inspiration and enlightenment that the Scriptures can bring. That seems to be, an obvious kind of indication of the story. It speaks to us. It tells us functionally what the resurrection is all about. What does this story tell us? This story reminds us that faith is beyond empirical proof. That we're going to have to go through life being people of belief even though we don't see directly. That we have to commit ourselves. We have to hand ourselves over. We've got to sort of join the group. What was Thomas's problem? As I interpreted, he was alienated. He felt out of it. Something had happened he wasn't part of. So faith is supposed to bring us into the group like it did for him. Make us one with, solidarity with the other people who are attempting this same thing, who are committed to Jesus of Nazareth. So, the story tells us about the common condition. We have to commit ourselves to Jesus, accept Jesus as raised before we'll ever know the meaning of it. It's like doing anything else in life. Until you get into it, you can't know what it's about. Faith is not an objective search like, well, here I am, I'm a neutral observer now. Now I'm going to see, if these things are really true or not. So like 2 + 2 is 4, and if I can prove that empirically, then I'll jump into it and become part of it. The faith search isn't like that. The faith search has to be involving. You notice it's the same thing. Jesus doesn't appear to people who aren't open. I mean, they don't have appearances to Pontius Pilate or to the closed Pharisees. You have it only to the searchers, the people who are hurting, the people who are questing, the people who are at least open to faith. These are the people who encounter Jesus. So what is the story telling us? That that's the kind of stance we have to get if we're ever going to have any sense of what resurrection is all about. It yields its fruit, its inner message, the harmony of what it's all about, only to the honest inquirer, only to the person who's achieved a certain degree of openness. Faith and resurrection go together. You can't have that appreciation of it apart from that kind of commitment to the Lord. So, Thomas is a neat figure. He represents 20th century problems. I like to talk about him as very contemporary figure, because what does he want? Empirical proof. He wants it in black and white. He wants to feel it, touch it. That's the only way he's going to believe. That's what we call scientism, reductionism, all kinds of isms, and that plagues us today in the world. Many of our young people think in those terms. I've got to have this proof. And yet, what we're saying is that faith eludes that. Not that it's unreasonable, but it can't be quantified like that. It can't be empirically proved or logically figured out. The narrative stories are beautiful. The right question is, what do they mean to me? How do they touch my heart? That's the way they were intended, and I think that's somehow the way they have to be heard. Okay, let's see what kind of responses we have to that, or questions, comments, fill-ins. First of all, you're probably looking at the claim in the end of John's Gospel. I think that's the only place you really have a claim like that. Generally agreed that the evangelists are not eyewitnesses. You've got to distinguish apostles from evangelists. The apostles are eyewitnesses. To be an apostle, you had to have been with Jesus from the beginning. You had to have been there from his baptism all the way through. That made you a privileged witness to that and a founding member of the whole church, first bishops and so on. They are eyewitnesses. They experienced all of this. The evangelists, those are something else. These are people who much later, year 70, 85, 90, 95, round in there, are the ones who write down what the community remembers about the original eyewitnesses and what they have told them after it's gone through a long oral period. Now, that's generally the situation. Now, what you get in the Scriptures at times, you have to remember that we're dealing with different literary forms. In other words, they don't write biographies the way we would write biographies. In modern history, modern biography is a relatively recent thing. They wrote the Bible, and especially the Gospels, as documents of faith. They're written by believers to convince other people to believe. They are not an attempt at objective reporting. They use literary forms to make their point. And one of the ways they would do it is through this statement at the end of John's Gospel about being an eyewitness to all of this, and the whole world couldn't contain the books if you wrote it all down and so on. You're dealing with literary convention that is very common in the first century, or beyond that, but especially at that time. Distinguish apostles from evangelists, realize that the Scriptures are using literary forms. One of the literary forms is this narrative construction of the resurrection appearances. Now, it doesn't mean, I don't know where that goes, but it doesn't mean Jesus did not appear. In fact, the very first statements, without any stories, without any elaboration, is that Jesus appeared to Simon. It doesn't say anything about it. Well, it doesn't tell us anything about that we'd like to know about it. This is the earliest account, is in 1 Corinthians 15. And as we know, Paul wrote long before the Gospels are written. So we got that probably written in the 50s. But it says there's an appearance. Jesus appears to Peter, and then he appeared, to 500 all at once. That's the earliest account that we've got of resurrection. And it is an appearance statement. What we're dealing with here, it appears, are constructed kinds of accounts that elaborate on that fundamental experience in order to teach us the lessons and to help us to know what the resurrection is all about. Again, my suggestion is that for purposes of faith and who do you say that I am, the real question is, how does the story strike us? Because that's why they wrote it. They didn't write it with that kind of question in mind. The question of historicity is a modern question. They didn't care about that. That's our question. And that question can get in the way of getting the meaning, letting the story interact. The question is, we hear the story of Thomas, what does it do to us? Who do we identify with in the story? Where do we see our own blind spots? That's the value of the story technique. And that's the fifth in this series on Christology. And I was thinking that here we are talking about a fellow who lived 2,000 years ago, who got one line in secular history, that he died under Pontius Pilate. Never wrote a book and never traveled, never led an army, never did any of those things. And here we are, a bunch of us assembled 2,000 years later, trying to answer a question that he posed to some of his followers. The question being, who do you say that I am? It really is quite remarkable sort of thing. By any standards, whether you're a believer or not, whether you're Christian or not, whatever, it is an amazing thing that people 2,000 years later would be talking about this fellow and studying about him, reading books about him, and so on. He really didn't do that much. In fact, did very little during his lifetime. So that's sort of amazing in itself. And then when we're doing this Christology, we're doing something that people have been doing for 2,000 years. That is, trying to probe more deeply into the mystery of this man. It seems as though he is inexhaustible. No one ever figures him out totally, or no one's ever satisfied with what they know about him. Each succeeding age is posing that question anew. Who do you say that I am? Each succeeding generation has to do the Christological work to try to probe more deeply into his meaning, his purpose, his person, what he was all about. So that sort of sets the stage for what we are about in this whole series. And we are trying to use a story form to accomplish this, trying to look at the stories in the Bible and let them touch us in mind and heart. One of the things we're learning about stories is that they do more than just help us intellectually. That is, stories have a way of piercing through the usual modes of thinking and doing things for us maybe that we're not even aware of. Perhaps some of the stories that we hear and know we carry with us, don't even think about them for a while, but they'll come back at odd moments and provoke more thought and so on. So tonight we're moving into the fifth question here. I was just thinking that overall, after we have this whole course, we really should know a lot about modern Christology. We're taking various aspects, the historical Jesus and Jesus and salvation and so on. And tonight we take up a really key part of all of it, and that is Christ and the resurrection. And next time we'll be talking about Christ and liberation, the last of in this series. Well, I'm going to follow through with the same methodology that we have been using all along of trying the story forms for understanding this. That one door must be locked back there, isn't it? coming to the door. Okay. We'll continue on with our methodology. One thing I obviously am trying to do throughout all of this is to take the stories from different perspectives, and hoping that the change of perspective will show us things that we haven't seen before, will help us to get the fresh feeling to the... We had a dialogue homily at our church the other day, and we were talking about this whole method and so on, and that was sort of a general feeling, I suppose, of the group, that we hear the stories and that there's an automatic click-off. When we hear the Bible stories, we've heard them so often that as soon as the first lines come out, that there's sort of an automatic tuning out because we know it already, and you can do that easily because you can pick up at any point and remember what was there before and then keep going with it. And it seems to be a sort of a psychological thing to do that. So what I've been trying to do is tell the stories from a different perspective so that they sound different, and pick up different angles and use maybe a little imagination on it so that we begin to try to hear it in this fresh way. That's the purpose of the approach. And, okay, got to try it. I don't seem like I want to do that. Have to do it anyway. I mean, sooner or later I'm standing here, and before long I'm going to have to start. I wonder why that is. I remember studying under a psychiatrist one time, and his comment, you know, when he'd forget something, he wouldn't say, I forgot. He'd say, why am I blocking on this? Maybe I can ask that question. Why don't I want to start? I don't know why. However, I'm starting anyway. I hope you didn't turn the tape recorder. Oh, you did. Too bad. Maybe you see somebody taking this tape out, you know, try to listen to this tape, you know, and they did this tape out, and they hear this fellow rambling about why am I blocking? Maybe skip that whole first part, you know, and go on. I think I know why I don't want to do this now. I'm going to do it anyway. My father said, if you don't want to do it, that was the best reason in the world for doing it. So I will now do it. Okay, this is a story of a guy who's following the Apostle Peter around. When he's observing him, you know, that period. He's sort of interested in this. So he's interested in these people who came down from Galilee to Jerusalem. And he says, well, to tell you the truth, I don't, the beginning didn't think much of this fellow Peter at all. Very impetuous fellow, sort of a loudmouth. And you get down to, he kept shooting his mouth off all the time, and I wasn't too sure he could ever follow through on all the stuff that he would talk about. But on the other hand, he was the leader of this group of people who were following this fellow Jesus. So he must have had something on the ball. I don't know exactly what it was, or I figure he wouldn't have turned out to be the leader of those 12 people. But when the crunch came for him, he ended up denying his own teacher. In fact, I was in a courtyard out in front of the praetorium there, and saw Peter roaming around. Anybody could tell him by his accent. He was a Galilean. And this young woman asked him some questions. He couldn't even stand up to that young woman. Said, you're one of his followers. He said, no, I never heard of him, and so on. Denied his own teacher. Well, you can't think much of a guy like that. But then, after he left there, he sort of realized what he did. He really took it hard. He went out and wept bitterly. He was, in many ways, a defeated man. You could tell that he had let down himself and his teacher through all of those years. He had put all of his trust in Jesus and the coming of the kingdom and so on, and all that seemed down the drain, and he really was a defeated man. In fact, it wouldn't have surprised me at all if I would have heard that he committed suicide, just like one of those other 12 did, a fellow by the name of Judas. Wouldn't have surprised me at all. He was just despondent as all get out. Well, I really hadn't thought much about him after that. In fact, it was about a month and a half later, and we were all in Jerusalem. In fact, it was a big feast of Pentecost, and there were Jews from all over the civilized world there in Jerusalem. It was really crowded. And some of us were walking around, and suddenly we heard this big noise. It was like a great big wind that came. And sort of really got our attention, and we went over there to near a house where this wind seemed to be. And there was a bunch of people. There must have been over 100 of them there. They were all jumping up and down. They're all excited, and I didn't know what was going on. One of my friends next to me said, "Geez, all those people must be drunk." But when we started listening to them talk, it was amazing because we could all hear them in our own language. We were from all over the civilized world, and these guys were almost all of them were Galileans, over 100 of them, talking like crazy, but we could all understand them in our own language. It really was quite amazing. And as we said, we sort of felt these guys must be drunk the way they're acting. And just then, while we're all crowded around there, a big bunch of us, one of them jumped up, started to talk, and I noticed right away who it was. It was this fellow, Simon Peter, that I'd been so interested in. And to tell you the truth, he didn't look like a defeated man at all. In fact, he seemed to have great confidence. He seemed to know what he was doing. And he even started joking as he began his talk, which I thought was sort of neat. He said something about, "Hey, we aren't drunk. Hear your people saying we're drunk. We're not drunk. It's only 9 o'clock in the morning. Don't drink at that time of the morning." And then he used a very clever sermon he gave, because he used that as a jumping off point to start getting his point across. He said, "No, we're not drunk. What is happening here is," and then he went back to one of our prophets, something all of us understood there in Judah. He says, "What's happening is that the prophecy of Joel is being fulfilled here. As Joel had said, as probably you remember, that the Spirit will be poured forth on all of mankind, and your sons and daughters will prophesy, and the young will see visions, and old people will dream dreams." That's what Peter started out. Clever way to begin a sermon, I thought. And then he said, quite personal, it was like he was taking us in on some sort of a secret that he had. He said, "Now, people of Israel, I want you to listen to this." Oh, and it's like, boy, here comes the big thing. Sure enough, he started talking. He said, "This Jesus, the Nazarene, was a man sent from God to you with miracles and wonders and signs. He was sent to you from God in order to do these wonderful things. And yet, according to the plan of God, he was delivered up. And you even handed him over to pagans." That Jesus had been crucified must have been about 6 weeks or so ago, I guess, that happened. We all remember that. That was nothing unusual. When he got to that part about saying that this was according to God's plan, though, my ears sort of perked up at that. It sounded a little strange that this all had happened according to some mysterious plan that God had. That was sort of shocking. Then he comes on with the line. Right after he said all of that, he's delivering up the pagans. Then he said, "But God freed him from death's bitter pangs and raised him up again." Well, I'll tell you could have heard a pin drop. The whole throng just quieted down. It was like a shock. The Father had raised him up to life again. Just stopped and sort of tried to drink that in. Peter, he was just standing up there in sort of total command of the situation, just letting that sink in. Then he went on. Started talking about David, King David. Got a little murky here. I wasn't even sure if I could follow. He said David, he lived and died and buried. In fact, we know where his tomb is. We know where David is buried. But he made a statement about his soul not being chained in the netherworld. Well, he must have been talking, I guess, about this Jesus of Nazareth. I guess he was trying to tell us that this whole thing that David had seen had been fulfilled in Jesus of Nazareth, this one who had been crucified. He went on and he pulled it all together at the end. Marvelous way of summing up his sermon. He said, "Now let the whole house of Israel hear this now. And hear this and get it straight beyond any doubt. God, Yahweh, has made both Lord and Messiah this Jesus whom you crucified." Well, none of us could miss the point. It was clear. Peter and these 100 and so people, they're all excited because they thought that Jesus had been raised to life. And it's funny, as we listened to Peter, he was like a charismatic figure. He wasn't like that fisherman from Galilee anymore at all. He wasn't like this guy who I was afraid was going to commit suicide. He was filled with the Spirit. The Spirit was right. The Spirit just came right out of him and touched us all. I was deeply touched. In fact, a whole bunch of us were deeply touched. And somebody in the crowd yelled out to him, "Well, what should we do? What should we do about this now that you've told us that Jesus had been raised to life?" And he said, looked at us and he said, "What you've got to do is get baptized and believe that Yahweh has raised Jesus to life and that he is constituted as the Lord." You know what? There were 3,000 of us in that crowd. People from all over the world. We all spoke different languages, but we all understood Peter clearly. None of us missed his point. And 3,000 of us got baptized right that day. And ever since, I've been filled with the Spirit. I feel like something's been communicated to me. I feel a new strength. And what I've dedicated my life to now is going out and trying to spread this. I got a different feeling about this fellow Peter now. You know what we call him? We call him the Rock. Yeah, we call him the Rock because he's been able to gather us together, because he's the source of strength for all of us. This guy who denied the Lord is now the leader of the whole community. Gives us a lot of hope, especially in moments when we're down and out and feeling sorry for ourselves and feel like we're a failure. We figure that if this guy who denied the Lord can be made the leader and can be the rock, then indeed there's hope for all of us. We want to look at that now and begin our analysis. I'm really going to do 3 of these stories, and each one is supposed to bring out some other aspect of this whole idea of what the resurrection means, how we look at Jesus in terms of resurrection. What I told you is the first of the 4 great sermons in the Acts of the Apostles. There's 4 great sermons. We call them the Kerygma, the original proclamation. We think that it represents some of the early ways that the Christians tried to communicate to the people what their faith was all about. What it tells us is that the resurrection is really the key to the whole of the understanding of Christianity. Paul said that if Christ has not been raised to life, then our whole faith is in vain. We are the most foolish of people, he said, if Christ has not been raised to life. So the resurrection becomes the key to Christian belief. That's why these days we like to say not so much we're saved by the death of Jesus, but we're saved by the death and resurrection of Jesus. That's why a lot of people think we ought to have a 15th station in our churches, so that it doesn't end just with Jesus being buried, but that we get to the good news side of it. The good news side is that he has been raised to life. So the most primitive statement is that Almighty God, Yahweh, has raised the man Jesus to life. Now that's interesting, because you'll notice that it doesn't say Jesus rose from the dead. We often use that kind of language. It is found in John's Gospel in one place that the Son of Man is risen from the dead. But the characteristic phrase in the New Testament is that Yahweh has raised the man Jesus to life. That becomes the most simple statement of our faith. All contained right there. The whole of the New Testament is written from that perspective. The whole way of understanding who the early Christians are is from that perspective. That is what has changed them. That is what is different for them. It's been changed because Jesus has been raised to life. Now let me tell you a couple of ways I think we should not understand this statement. The first thing is that it is not really a statement about the resuscitation of a dead body or a reanimation of a body. It is not, and I suppose people have heard me say this before, it's not as though Jesus came back and walked around the streets of Jerusalem like he used to, and people are looking at him and saying, geez, we thought you were killed not long ago. It doesn't mean that. It's not what it's all about, as the stories of the resurrection tell us as we go along. So it's not the resuscitation of a body. At the other extreme, it does not mean that we're dealing with a subjective experience of the apostles, a merely subjective experience. A great theologian of the 20th century by the name of Rudolf Bultmann made the statement that Jesus rose in the kerygma. Or he put it another way too, he said Jesus rose in the faith of the disciples. Now when many people read that or heard that, or much popular theology of the 20th century has said, oh, I see, what it means is that somehow these disciples began to think that Jesus was raised to life. Or they got over their fears and their despondency and shaped up, and how were they going to explain it? So they said, well, Jesus rose from the dead. So I'm saying it's not that. Just like it isn't the resuscitation of a body, it's not a mere subjective experience on the part of the disciples of Jesus. Trying to put it positively, however, what does it mean to talk about resurrection? First of all, I would say it is a statement about God. It's a statement that God indeed is the faithful one, that God is trustworthy, that the one that Jesus addressed as Abba would not let his son Jesus just be swept away by the powers of evil, that God indeed does not abandon his people. He's not a fickle kind of God who would stay with someone for a while and then just forget about him when the times got tough. So the resurrection is first of all a statement about who God is. Who is God? He's the one who never forgets us. Even though a mother should forget her child, God does not forget us. God holds us in the palm of his hand. God is the faithful one. He is trustworthy. All of this is indicated to us by this notion of the resurrection of Jesus. Second thing I would say that this resurrection means is it's a statement about the cross. It's a statement that the cross, paradoxically, is not defeat, but victory. That God's love triumphs right in the midst of the worst of situations. That the cross is not simply a result of sin, and it's not simply defeat, but it is the very event that heals us, that brings us solidarity, that brings us, as we talked about it last week, salvation. So it's a statement about the cross, the paradox of the cross, that what looks like defeat exactly isn't. That victory comes in the worst moment. the most terrible of times, exactly is the moment when God is able to do good things. Thirdly, resurrection is a statement about love. It's a statement about the power of love. That love is the most important energy force that's going on in the world. That love is what makes the world go round. That love is the energy that is fueling the whole process. That love is stronger than death. That's one way of thinking what resurrection means. That death doesn't have the last word. That the bonds of love are so strong that they cannot be broken by death. And finally, it's a statement about Jesus. That is, that Jesus was who he claimed to be. That Jesus was the final prophet. Remember that during his lifetime, Jesus spoke with authority, and he used to say, "Amen, amen, I say to you." Oh, he didn't speak like the scribes or Pharisees. He came right out. This is the way it is. This is how we're supposed to understand the law. Spoke with this great authority. He claimed in many ways to be the final spokesman. He gave indication that no one would come after him who would overturn his message or surpass it or straighten it out or have to reinterpret it in totally new ways. No, he was convinced that he was the bearer of the kingdom, that he knew the secrets of Abba, his Father, that he was communicating this to us. So what does resurrection say? That he was what he claimed to be, that is, the final prophet. What does it mean about Jesus? It means that death could not defeat him or contain him, that he became life-giving spirit, in the words of Paul the Apostle, that he then was no longer confined to one space or time, one little country, one tiny bit of history, but because of resurrection he becomes available for all people at all times, everyone who ever lived. He breaks the space-time dimensions, moves into the new age, the new period, where he's able to touch us in so many different ways. As the first sermon of Peter said, what does it mean about Jesus? It means he's been constituted as Lord and Messiah. Lord and Messiah. He's been made that through the power of Yahweh. He is the awaited one. He is now the Lord, the Kyrios, the one who is in charge of the whole world. He now sits at the right hand of the Father so that he can judge all people, all aspects of what goes on in our world. It means that Jesus is now alive, influential, touching the world. So, Peter gives us the first sermon. Now, the story tells us, I suppose we can touch into the story in many ways. Now, what it's designed to do, from the viewpoint of the bystander, is to help us to see that we had this tremendous transition here from despondency, which he interpreted as maybe even a desire for suicide or moving close to that, to exaltation, to joy, to commitment to a new kind of life. So when we hear the story, and then also the story is supposed to bring together for us the simple message of what the resurrection is. Not a claim that a body's been brought back to life, and not just a subjective experience, but the most important statements about life. That is, life can be trusted. The one we can hand ourselves over because the great God is near to us. It's a statement about the cross, that it is the center point of our religion because it includes already within it the seeds of victory, the resurrection. It is a statement about love and the power of love in the world. It's a statement that Jesus is indeed alive and influencing us. Well, some ways to try to get a hold of what we're talking about when we're talking about the resurrection of Jesus. I'd like for you now, invite you to turn to the person next to you and to spend a couple minutes trying to understand what I said. Why don't you try to see what you got out of that, what kind of sense it makes to you. Maybe
said it was not a resuscitation of the body. I don't know exactly what you mean by that.
Well, we'll see that when we take up the empty tomb, that'll arise again. What that statement is, one way of knowing what the statement means is to say that if you had a resuscitated body like Lazarus would be an example. Well, Lazarus is walking around again. Everyone's saying, hello, Lazarus, how are you? You know, what's it like to be in a tomb for a few days and so on? You must have had a near-death experience or something, you know. I mean, but Lazarus is walking around and eating 3 meals a day and sleeping 8 hours and so on. That's a resuscitated body. He is in this time-space dimension. To say that Jesus is, that's not what happened with Jesus is to say he's no longer in this time-space dimension. He doesn't need 7 hours of sleep. He doesn't need 3 meals a day. He isn't confined to one place. It is to say that it's the beginning of the new age, that he's moved into a new mode of existence. And so the word physical is not very helpful because just like when we're talking about the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, the word physical isn't very helpful because you end up thinking a little man is inside the bread, you know. I mean, Christ is really present to the world, but he's not physically present as in living in our time-space dimension. That's what it's supposed to mean. And of course, the other side of what I'm saying is clearly that it is not just a subjective experience. He has really been raised. I mean, Christ is really present in the Eucharist, even though he isn't physically present. No, and that's, you know, it doesn't. Physical isn't the only way something is real. I mean that he is. I mean that the presence is a word that describes different modes of interaction. Let me put it to you this way: that there's some people in this room now who are physically present, but in any real sense, they're not here. That's right. Yeah, we all know that. I mean, you're going to be sitting with one other person in a room, and you know that. I mean, their body is there, but their mind, all that counts, all that's human, might be someplace else. They don't care what you're saying. They're not interested in that you're there. Their mind is on someone else. Somebody can be 1,000 miles away and more present to us than somebody who's physically present. Because human existence has different modes of the way we relate, not just in the physical. So, I mean, that's just to give a clue as to what I'm talking about. What we really say is that Jesus is raised to life, but it's a life that is characteristic of the new age. The time-space dimensions as we know them don't apply. And we know next to nothing about that other mode of existence. But it's the same mode of existence we'll have after our own death. My own mentor, Carl Rahner, thinks that resurrection of the body occurs for everybody as soon as they die. You know, it's common to think of resurrection of the body happening at the end time. Rahner thinks that the resurrection of the body occurs immediately, because what resurrection of the body means is that as a total person, we go into union with God. Now, you see, if you're taking only in physical terms, you'll say, aha, that's not possible because I see the corpse. You know, but that is to think only in physical terms, which you have to break out of, I think, if you're going to understand what resurrection is about. You can't think in literalist, physical terms and know what resurrection is. I think that's one way of saying what I'm trying to get at. Maybe. It depends on how I sense the group is. It depends on a lot of subjective factors, which at the moment I'm not able to decipher. Things going on in here and in here. And we'll see what kind of integration we achieve at that moment. Okay? Let me try another. Let me try another story. I want to tell you a story about a woman by the name of Mary. She came from a little town, up along the Sea of Galilee, the western shore up there. Oh, quite a remarkable woman, really. Very religious person. And a lot of health problems, though. A lot of health problems. And one time when Jesus was walking around in Galilee, this woman came and to see him. Sure enough, Jesus, the miracle worker, the healer, looked at her, and there seemed to be sort of an instant rapport between the two. Interesting. Sort of a rapport, maybe a bit of chemistry between the two. And Jesus asked her about what she wanted. She talked about her health and so on, and like that she was cured. She said, it was almost as though 7 devils went out of me, just like that, when he cured. Well, she became a follower of Jesus. She felt that he really had something to say, and of course the cure didn't hurt any. In fact, she used to travel around with the 12 apostles, and she was with a group of women, as a matter of fact, quite a number of them that used to minister to the needs of Jesus and so on, tried to take care of him. She was with Joanna, who was the wife of one of Herod's stewards, you might remember, and also Susanna was in that group. Few of them had money. Few of those women had money, and they used to support Jesus and his band as they traveled around. Well, when Jesus decided to go down to Jerusalem, a fateful thing, you might remember that Jesus' disciples didn't want him to go, but he seemed to be adamant about it, and he went down. Well, the whole group of women went down with him. Some of them were kidding around and said, I don't think this group can make it on their own down there, And so we went down there to keep ministering, much as that he had been doing. The women were trying to attend to their needs and so on, listening to the sermons and so on. Well, things got a little difficult there down in Jerusalem, and the master gathered a bunch of us together for a final meal. The whole group of women were there, and the 12 were there, and it was sort of almost like a Passover meal. And during the meal, Jesus took the bread and blessed it, broke it, and gave it all around to us, and shared the last cup of the meal with us, and said that this was his blood given in the covenant. Well, the whole group was very taken by this. Jesus at that point left, and he took the apostles with him, went out to pray, he said. Well, the group of women went off by themselves, and were heard that before long that Jesus got arrested. Some of them went along there in the courtyard to sort of see the proceedings that were going on with before Pilate and so on. And they heard that Jesus was going to be sentenced to death. Well, a lot of the men ran away, but the women didn't. This particular woman we're talking about, she, Mary by name, she stayed around and with the other women. And we're sort of watching from a distance. In fact, they saw Jesus come out and carrying the cross, and they took him out to the place called the Skull, sort of shaped like a skull. That's why they call it that, Golgotha, the skull place. And they watched from a distance while Jesus was crucified. One woman, Mary, was just terribly upset. She flashed through her mind all that he talked about the kingdom is lost. The whole cause that he kept espousing. He's going to save Israel. It's all down the drain. But that was as nothing to her. What really bothered her was the suffering of that man on the cross. It was the personal sense of loss she had, her friend, the one who had healed her. It's a terrible moment. Even at the distance where they were, suddenly they heard Jesus weakened, just about ready to die. He cried out with a loud voice. They could hardly believe it. Where the volume came, with a loud voice, and he said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And Mary was relieved. She was relieved in a way. She was glad that he wasn't suffering anymore. Her heart was aching for the sense of loss, but she was glad that the terrible torture was over. A lot of the women then said they were going to leave, and they took off. But another Mary, mother of Josie, stayed with her. Mary just couldn't get herself to leave. She stayed right there. And as they were watching, they saw a guy they knew. It was Joseph of Arimathea. He was a secret member of their group. He came with a big linen cloth. And he started taking the body down. They didn't go over, but they just sort of watched from a distance and took the body down. They found out later on he had gone right to Pontius Pilate and asked for permission to do that. It's an amazing thing because all this time he had been a secret member of the group. He never came out in the open. He was afraid. Must have got his courage up somehow. Went right to Pilate and asked for the body. Well, the women watched as he took the body down and took it to a tomb, new tomb, hewn out of a big rock. They watched as he put the body of Jesus in there and put a great big stone, as was their custom, in front of the opening of the tomb. Well, at that point, they did feel it was time to go back and join the rest of their group. It was Passover day, and it was just a terrible time. Mary cried all day long, tried to keep herself busy and so on, keep herself going. She was terribly despondent. She made plans with some of her friends that Mary, the mother of James and Salome, they said, well, tomorrow morning, let's get up real early before dawn and take the spices and we'll go there and anoint the body of the Master. So, crack of dawn, they got up, headed for the tomb, and still while they're walking there, talking, crying, trying to figure out how they're going to get this big stone moved, and as they get close, they can see the stone's already moved away. They get there, and they were a little bit afraid, but Mary, always sort of bold, she walked right into the tomb. She got inside there, and they saw a young man sitting there in white garments on the right side. They walked in. It was over on the right side. And the young man said to them, don't be afraid. You're looking for Jesus. He has been raised up. He's not here. Go tell the disciples and Peter he's going ahead of you to Galilee, where you see him just as he said. So he told them to go back and tell the rest of the group that Jesus has been raised and that he's going to see him in Galilee. Meet him there. Well, three women were startled and confused, and the others started heading back to tell the rest of the people, but Mary stayed behind a few minutes. She let them go. And as she's standing there, she turned around, and she saw some guy standing there. And she thought it was the gardener, and so she went up, she said, maybe he took the body. So she went up to him and said, well, did you take the body? If you did, just tell me where you put him. Because we come to anoint the body. Just then, the one she took to be the gardener looked at her and said, Mary. Just like that, in an instant, she recognized him. It was Jesus himself. She answered, Rabboni, Master. She wanted to grab him and give him a hug. Jesus said, No, he says, I have to wait with that. I have to ascend to the Father. I have to complete this whole business here. But he said, what you got to do is go back to the disciples and tell them what you've seen. Go back to the group and tell them that you've actually met me. Tell them that I have been raised to life. She hated to drag herself away from them. She just wanted to stay there and talk with them. Feel the healing coming over her. But she did as the Master said. She went back and told the group, all excited, said, I've seen him. The Master is alive. I looked at her and said, what kind of nonsense is this? What kind of tales are this? And they wouldn't believe her. She was frustrated. She kept going, no, I saw him. Saw him. And they wouldn't believe her. And so she thought within her heart, well, I guess they need their chance too, to meet him directly like I did. They have to see for themselves and encounter the Lord before they're really going to believe. And so Mary tried to calm herself and contain within herself the deep feeling of joy and peace and integration that she felt. And she was just waiting for the moment when the others would have that same experience and they could celebrate joyfully together.